On that fateful evening of January 1989, I got a call from the news desk telling me to head for the motorway. I got to the top of that embankment, walked down 100 steps cut into the earth, and then out into the middle of the motorway.
The shocking sight that greeted me and dozens of rescuers was the broken fuselage of a British Midland Boeing 737. It had been flying from Heathrow to Belfast when it developed an engine problem and was diverted to East Midlands Airport. It never made it, crashing onto the busy motorway just short of the runway and coming to rest on the slope.
I collected lots and lots of documents and letters of thanks from people after the incident.
At the time of the crash, Alan Parker was Leicestershire's chief ambulance officer. Now retired, he has an archive of documents from the disaster at his Leicestershire home. Newspaper cuttings, reports, letters of thanks from survivors' families, even one from the Prime Minister herself.
This document here, though, is probably the most important and interesting one. It's the control log.
That night is brought back to him in minute-by-minute detail by the official ambulance service log.
2026, we got a radio message to say that it's believed down on the motorway.
They quickly realised the survivors were remarkably lucky.
The difference with this one was it was a survivable air crash. The majority of air crashes up to that point have been an impact, big ball of flame, and nothing much to do except for clearing up the mess afterwards. Here we had a significant number of casualties, a flow of patients coming out, and then we were into the distribution of casualties so that we didn't overload particular hospitals and making sure that people went as far as possible to the appropriate hospitals. And the fact that the airport fire service were very quickly on the scene. They came out of the airport and came down the southbound carriageway on the motorway, stopped and just jetted it with foam across the carriageway, which undoubtedly negated the fire threat.
In those days, ambulance staff were not paramedics. The first ambulance crew on the scene had a male driver and female attendant.
Several people grabbed the attendant and said, "Thank God you are here," and they frog marched her up the bank, helped her onto the wing and pushed her through a window into the aircraft. And so she was effectively the first rescue inside the aircraft on her own.
The disaster meant a new emergency first, helicopters to ferry the injured to hospital. But even that had unforeseen consequences.
We were then having to contend with the safety issues of helicopters landing on the motorway. They're big aircraft. And several casualties were taken out, and I can remember my crew saying to them, "Don't worry, we've got you out, you're safe now. We're just going to pop you in this helicopter and fly you off to hospital." And people were saying, "Hang on a minute, I don't really want to fly again at this moment." So it was a new experience. We hadn't done CASEVAC by helicopter from anywhere in the UK, to my knowledge, from this type of incident before.
Alan Parker says shortly after the disaster, the authorities appealed for eyewitnesses to come forward. One man rang in to say he'd been driving along the motorway and had seen it in his rear view mirror. "How close were you?" they said. "Well," he said, "the plane took the aerial off the back of my car."
We actually were on scene for the whole week, covering the rescue personnel to make sure that there were no casualties left, or any of those that got injured were dealt with promptly.
As survivors recovered, many faced a long journey back to Northern Ireland.
Some of our staff adopted some of the casualties, and one chap actually flew all the way from England back to Belfast with his casualty when he was discharged from hospital, and handed him over to the Northern Ireland Ambulance Service because the guy was frightened of flying. So he actually took him home.
The emergency services learnt from the disaster too.
Prior to this, ambulance, police and fire services always had a reasonably good relationship, but there was a little bit of tension between the services because we have different roles. After that, the emergency services in Leicestershire had a very, very close relationship, and to my knowledge that is still there. In addition to that, of course, there were the things like the brace position that Professor Angus Wallace developed, and a lot of research went into aircraft type injuries and how to prevent them, deal with them afterwards.
For Alan Parker, memories of the Kegworth disaster remain vivid.
It wasn't really until a year later, I don't think, that I realised the effect it had on me. On the Sunday night, the same Sunday night 12 months on, at about the same time, the phone rang. And it was the control room with another message of some sort. But I actually physically went cold. It suddenly brought it all back. And I guess the same thing applied to a lot of other people. So it takes time to move on, and you tend to put it to the back of your mind. And then 25 years on, you suddenly start to think, and it comes back very quickly. You know exactly what happened, what you were doing at the time.
All that's left near the scene of the crash is this plaque, which records that 47 people died. But it also pays tribute to the heroic efforts of the rescuers who made sure that 79 people did survive that terrible disaster. James Roberson, BBC East Midlands Today, near Kegworth.